Okay, so welcome to Transcendent Psychotherapist. I've got the absolute pleasure of interviewing Mark Vernon today about his wonderful, insightful and reflective and inspiring book, Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps. Mark, like myself, is a psychotherapist and deeply interested in philosophy, spirituality and theology. And it was really a bit of a no-brainer for me to hook up with Mark and try and interview him and ask him about this book. So that's what we're doing today. I'm going to give a little bit of a bio on Mark, so you've got some background. He might want to qualify a few points after that. So Mark has a degree in theology from the University of Oxford and another theology and physics degree from Durham University. He also has a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy from University of Warwick. He's the author of several books on subjects from friendship and belief to well-being and love, including A Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness, based on the ideas of the Oxford Inkling, Owen Barfield, and most recently, Dante's Divine Comedy, A Guide for the Spiritual Journey. Of course, more recently, 7 Steps. He freelances and writes for various publications he's done in the past, like Aeon Magazine, The Idler, Church Times, and The Tablet, as well as having written for other publications. He's appeared on BBC Radio 4's In Our Time, alongside other programmes and regularly podcasts and YouTubes, and was formerly a Church of England priest. Mark now obviously has a private practice in psychotherapy. So welcome, Mark. Good to have you here.
Thanks very much indeed for that introduction.
Pleasure. Yeah. Did you feel that was pretty much accurate?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time wandering around quite what I was doing, so it's a reflection of that as much as anything else.
Yeah, we were just looking at the Wikipedia entry, weren't we, a moment ago, and it wasn't quite up to date. So yeah, someone somewhere needs to update their wiki entry. So yeah, it was a really interesting. I listened to it on Audible, so I had the pleasure of your actual voice, and I always prefer Audibles when it's the author, when you know their voice. You've seen them on YouTube, for example, and you've actually got their real voice. It's a lot better listen, I think. So I wonder if we just jump straight in. So my first question really is, or request, if you like, is to ask you about if you could introduce spiritual intelligence. What do you mean by it? Why do we need to recover it? And how does it differ, say, from emotional intelligence or religious and theological intelligence?
So I guess it's quite close to the last two, religious theological intelligence. Although I think spiritual intelligence would be the more intuitive knowing rather than the reasoning about, which
Yeah.
perhaps theological intelligence would major on. I mean, part of the reason for going for this subject is I was part of, well, I am part of a research group looking at whether there is such a notion of spiritual intelligence, and particularly against the background of artificial intelligence. And the broad idea within the research group is that the way to respond to artificial intelligence is not to panic, but
Right.
is to use this as a moment to ask ourselves, what kinds of intelligence do we have? So it doesn't get lost or forgotten, given the pervasiveness of artificial intelligence, which of course is only going to increase. And there are notions like emotional intelligence, which have been quite well worked out and defined. Roughly the ability to not just have feelings, but to be able to manage your feelings, understand what they mean in relation to others, and so not just get swept along by feelings. But is there a spiritual kind of intelligence? And sometimes those who've written about emotional intelligence do sort of knit in a bit of spiritual intelligence, by which they mean it's the capacity to find meaning, to put your feelings, if you like, within a broader network of associations that enables them to be navigated through purpose and ends, that kind of thing. But I think spiritual intelligence, there is such a thing that we have, which can be called spiritual intelligence, which is just that bit deeper than that. And in a way, it's the ground of all these other kinds of intelligences, because it's not just the capacity to reflect on them, but it's the ability we have to be even aware that we have this consciousness in its myriad forms. And that's significant because it provides a sort of basis from which everything else springs, or back to which everything can relate. And when you're aware of that ground, you can feel how it has, and feel in your mind's eye as much as it were, feel in your person, that it has certain qualities, and their qualities of stillness, their qualities of boundlessness, their qualities of reliability. And so that is the kind of awareness stroke intuition which I think the great spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions teach us we can become more aligned with in our lives, and is the basis, therefore, of human flourishing. So it's that notion of spiritual intelligence. Sometimes I've heard people summarize it as the awareness of awareness. And then a more biblical phrase might be, the still small voice. Someone else might talk about it in terms of the uncreated core. It's the kind of notion that's right at the edge of the words we can muster, because it is the source of the words that we try to muster. But nonetheless is foundational, I think, for who we are as human beings.
Almost like that sort of I am behind things, almost.
Yeah, no, Barfield felt that the notion of, well, the capacity to say I am, meaning having a sort of gathered sense of a unitive self, has a history. It evolved, and it co-evolved with the perception that there's a God about which you can say I am, or that even has said I am. And so that unity of all things, of being in monotheistic convictions, is only possible to relate to because there's a sort of microcosm of some, at least, possible unity of ourselves that can mirror that macrocosm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned there about AI as well. So, I mean, perhaps we could call spiritual intelligence SI. So we've got AI and SI. I don't know. And how do you tell us a little bit more about how, I mean, it's all the rage in the media at the moment, isn't it? It's a bit of, people are sort of concerned. Some people are like massive champions of AI, and some are kind of, worried about it. I think perhaps with just some justification. How would you sort of speak to the sort of general audience listening to this in terms of how they can develop their AI, their SI, and I don't know, how to then think of AI in that context?
Well, I think one important thing is to understand what AI actually is, because part of the trouble with its discussion in the media is that a lot of journalists seem to have watched too many Terminator films and sort of see an AI coming for them. Whereas I think the subtler risk is that because AI very effectively shapes quite large parts of our everyday lives now, because it's efficient, and both in terms of money, but also in terms of processing, we get rather absorbed into the way of life that's powerfully shaped by AI, and so forget that we have these other kinds of intelligence. So recognizing the limits of AI, I think, is really important. But then that can be a springboard from which to recognize the qualities of our own intelligence. And it's not just intelligence in the rational sense. It's knowing in the broadest sense. A lot of languages have two words for knowing. In French, savoir and connaître, and there's the knowing about. I know about the streets of London, but I also know the streets of London intuitively. I have a feel for them. And it's that feel, that intuition, which actually is the far more important kind of knowing for we human beings, because we're conscious, because we have this sense of being alive and not just being machines walking around, that AI just doesn't have. Again, you can read some people, at least, who say AI one day will have that. because they normally think of the brain through a kind of machine analogy. But I think the more sophisticated and knowledgeable people in AI, on the whole, think that's not the case, because they know that, for example, the brain is not actually a machine. It's sometimes helpful to use the analogy of the machine, but they perhaps know a bit of history and realize that in the 19th century, when steam engines seemed to be giving human beings immense power, the scientists of the day were very inclined to use steam engine analogies when discussing what it is to be human. So, you know, we're rather inclined to those analogies, but it's worth remembering they are just analogies. And so that then provides this sort of moment where we can actually ask ourselves again, you know, who are we, and what is valuable for us in life.
Yeah, that reminds me of sort of almost the psychodynamic, you know, this the repressed and the, you know, that steam engine analogy of the sort of, you know, the sort of the dynamics of the soul. Yeah. Is that what you were referring to, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, you see it in Freud. Earlier, Freud uses steam engine analogies quite a lot. You know, so he was quite inclined to think of repression as like a build-up of pressure that then needed some release every so often. And if it didn't get a good release, then it might become the release of a neurosis. But then Freud himself, you know, abandoned that kind of analogy for the psyche. And you know, I guess that when we realize that AIs aren't about to wake up and have more of a direct perception rather than a fantasy idea about them, so too, you know, the machine analogies for the human mind will move on, no doubt, to the next set of analogies.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of John Searle, isn't it? I think he's in that field, the philosopher of mind. Just thinking about sentience and so on, and just the Chinese room thought experiment, you know, where you could have a person in a room who receives this, it's got just a crib sheet of, you know, what card to exchange for what. So if he receives the Chinese symbol for, I don't know, how are you, he then knows to match that with outputting the symbol for I'm fine, thank you. You know, this idea that that's really all that's going on. However smart AI gets, that's really all it's doing, at least as far as we can tell. And it sounds like, you know, what you're saying really here is that, you know, there's a kind of knowing that for our kind of knowing that does that can do that kind of dealing with concepts and thoughts, presupposes an awareness and a consciousness underneath that. So it's a different kind of, it's not just simply mechanically processing data. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is that in parallel to the emergence of AI across the 20th and the 21st century, there has been the development of what's often called phenomenology, which is, if you like, the science of how we perceive. And one of the earliest points made by the phenomenologists is that we don't receive information as if it were a data input. Rather, the whole process is much more reflexive, that we receive through our senses facets of the world that then our minds make some sense of. But what shows up in the world is also shaped by the way our minds try to make sense. And again, an insight from Barfield is, I think, illuminating here. He was very interested in the way that words change meaning, and also how in different times and places, even some words didn't really exist at all. And the one that stands out for me is how in the ancient Greek world, in Homer, for example, there's no word for blue. And yet you think that in a Mediterranean environment, the one color you would need above all others is blue, because the sky's blue and the sea's blue, and you can hardly avoid either. But what Barfield suggests, and I think this is right and links into this phenomenological insight, is that the way that we see the world is deeply affected by the consciousness that we bring to the world, even to the point where certain things in the world can not be visible at all. And so in Homer, he talks about the sea as like red wine, is one of his famous analogies. It's the consistency of the sea, the qualities of the sea in that way that really struck him. And he didn't see the need to try and reach for identifying the sea purely through its empirical color. And so it's a much more, I don't know, blurred or porous engagement that we have with the world and that the world has with us. And the other much more well-known part of science where this is still being teased out and is still much debated is in the science of the very small, the physics of the very small in the quantum regions. And there's these big debates about indeterminacy, as Heisenberg put it, and how you can, not know everything about, say, a fundamental particle like an electron or like a photon. And it's only when you make an observation of some kind that these fundamental qualities are pinned down. And so the act of observation, in some way that's hugely debated, but yet no one would dispute, deeply shapes the world that then shows up. And so this sort of data reception model, which AI tends to presume, or at least discussions about AI tend to presume, there's very substantial science that already has been telling us that that's not the case.
Yeah, I'm glad you came with that. I was about to just literally thinking that as you put before you said it. Yeah, so in a sense, we've got this idea almost of the world, us kind of co-creating the world as being a kind of interaction between whatever reality is and our part of reality.
Yeah, and in a religious context, certainly in Christian theism, it's actually always been seen in this triangular form, that there's the grounds of being, the divine, and then there's, as it were, us, and then there's reality, beings arising from the origin of being itself, and that Trinitarian formula is active and dynamic. And so we need to factor in all these variables if we're to at least begin to develop better models, more accurate models of what's going on when we have the experience of being consciousness, of being conscious.
Does that, I know a little bit about Neoplatonism, I'm sure you know a lot more than me, but does that correspond with kind of ideas of like, so you've got like the one as the ground of all being, and then like the Nous or Nous, I never quite know how to pronounce it, intelligence itself. Does that then maybe connect into our spiritual intelligence as what we're accessing or participating in some way?
Yeah, it is a way of trying to model it. So yeah, in the Neoplatonic thought, to say something like Plotinus, there's the aboriginal one or unity, and then because it's an infinite unity, it in its very nature overflows or emanates, as Plotinus puts it, and it emanates into Nous, or mind, and then there's other sort of tiers of expansion, eventually reaching our most immediate and everyday perceptions. Although Plotinus argued that the human mind has a kind of flexibility and so can obtain the original transcendent perception as well, at least on occasion. Christianity tended to drew a lot on Neoplatonism, but modified it, and rather than seeing the one and then a kind of nous or logos emanating from it, it was inclined to say, no, actually, perhaps a more accurate way of seeing these things is that everything is always already fully realized in the divine, and that our awareness of these things is a kind of mirror or reflection of the eternal realization. And so Christians would say that a better way of talking about the one is to talk about the three in the one, rather than just kind of modal unity.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the question of the one and the many, sort of making sense of the multiplicity of things, and then how everything's kind of united. Yeah,
it's again, you're talking about things where the words sort of ultimately fall short,
yeah,
because we're trying to talk about the source of the words we're using. and the meaning of the word that the words are trying to capture. And so, you know, often actually in spiritual traditions, more than one model is useful because they all are trying to point to that which is beyond what they can actually capture. And so that beyondness is felt, as it were, in the spaces between the models, often as much as within the models themselves.
Yeah, sure. And because this is something I really know next to nothing about. I think you mentioned it briefly in the book, but so in Neoplatonism, you've got this idea, or some schools of it, I guess. Theurgy, is that? I mean, is there a sort of modern counterpart to? As far as I understand it, it's the idea of some kind of ritual process by which, through contemplation, you are reaccessing the one and the source of all. Does that connect to kind of what your thought is on how we need to use spiritual intelligence to connect to the source? Am I on the right track at all there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
theurgy it means the work of God in Greek, and it was much discussed amongst the Neoplatonists and the Stoics and others in the ancient Greek world, and then of course also by the Christians who borrowed hugely from that. There was dispute as well as agreement. One of the disputes, actually, which still is quite alive and kicking today, is whether this theurgy in rituals and practices, um, performed with material things as well as within the mind, um, whether it works by revealing the divine to us because through theurgy we conform to the divine, or whether it actually brings the divine to us because the human will can use theurgy to bring things about. And I think in the modern world, very widely is um, a, a place where this is sort of actively debated is in relation to manifestation, the idea of manifesting things. And broadly speaking, if you ever get into the world of manifesting, there's two sorts. There's the one sort that says, I want something, and if I desire it enough and maybe perform some theurgistic like rituals, like writing down on a piece of paper what I want, and then I can bring that about. The universe will give it to me.
Yeah.
And that would be the more sort of willed, human-centered kind of theurgy. Whereas I think the one that was certainly regarded as more sort of actual and divine by the Neoplatonists and certainly within Christianity, is the one where no, it says it's actually the other way round. It's by our wills conforming to the divine will that we then see our life reaching its sort of fullness and flourishing. And if we just take our will unreformed to this process, we might well be desiring the wrong things, and so
Mm.
even sort of undoing ourselves rather than
Mm.
fulfilling ourselves. And so, yeah, the idea of manifesting, you need to be careful. Is it presented to you as if I can make the universe do what I want, or is it more I can learn to do what the universe seeks?
And I mean, that reminds me, is that sort of well, for me, it's sort of associations with sort of resonances with sort of traditional opposition to sort of magic, being thought of as more kind of manipulative, or trying to put yourself at the center in a sense, rather than that kind of harmonizing yourself with the will of God, if you like. Is that I'm in the right ballpark there? Do you think? Or
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, take something like astrology,
Mm.
and as discussed by, say, a Renaissance philosopher like Ficino. And if you read the letters of Ficino, you'll realize that he, as it were, was a believer in astrology. It was an active dynamic within his life. He's constantly referencing the planets and then various metals that channel the influence of the planets. But in his philosophical discussion of astrology, he comes to the conclusion that um, if all things share in the divine life in some way, not just ourselves, but the material world around us and the cosmic world above us, then we by our contemplation of the material world and the cosmos, can become more alive to the divine active within us. And so in the inanimate world, certain qualities of the divine will be present to the exclusion of others. But for we human beings who potentially can fully share in the divine life across all of its manifestations, we can learn to cultivate, say, one kind of quality by, say, contemplating one particular planet or one kind of material, but then bring in others as well. So he saw a Christian word would be sacramental. He saw the universe as sacramental or symbolic, and symbolic in the active sense, not just one thing stands for another, but one thing communicates another. And yeah, so astrology proper, Ficino said, is different from magic, which again tries to use materials in the world to bring about a kind of human desire, rather than to relate to materials in the world to bring about a divine awareness.
Golly, and this, I'm just going to go with the resonances, things that are coming up in my mind as you're saying. It's kind of making me think of two things, making me think of that sort of need almost after modernity to get a re-enchantment of the world. The Greeks seem to see the cosmos as alive in some sense, but I'm probably chucking loads at you here, but just while it's in my mind still. Also, I'm mindful of the alchemists within Jung. Is there, help me sort the connections out there, Mark? Something was kind of clicking in place for me.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, it's interesting in Jung, he gets interested in alchemy, and although Jung majors on the kind of alchemy that's the remaking of the human soul in order that it can become divine, the philosopher's stone that can transmute us into the gold, which is the aboriginal source. Jung had to wade through a lot of other kinds of alchemy, which was much more straightforwardly about how to manipulate base metal in order to produce actual gold and therefore become wealthy or generate wealth for your sponsor, your king. Now, Jung wasn't so interested in that kind of alchemy, but what he was interested is in the alchemists who saw that the true alchemy takes place in the soul of the alchemist, and that the chemistry is just a kind of meditative practice that helps to focus that and bring that about, and then provides a lot of metaphors for Jung to try and describe his psychology as well. So the therapy, going to see a therapist, is a bit like being sealed in the retort, as he puts it. And then there's a kind of breaking down and melting down of the parts of the psyche in order that they then might be reformed within the sacred space of the retort or the therapy room. So yeah, you get this split. Even in the discussion of alchemy. I should say that I don't have much about alchemy, if anything at all. I don't think in a book, but nonetheless, it's a lot of fun talking about it now, because it's very these are all, I don't know, maybe it's not a surprise to people, but these are very active considerations. Maybe because the world can so often feel disenchanted, and we yearn to know it as enchanted again, because we know ourselves to be enchanted creatures.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was going to ask you as well, because we've got like just watch other videos with you, and you kind of refer to this in step 2 or 3, I think, of the book as well. So the non-dual and idealist tradition. So I'm a kind of big admirer of like Rupert Spira, who's kind of brought that kind of online and very kind of made it very accessible, I think, for sort of a Western audience, the non-dual path. And Bernardo Kastrup, of course, I think you've spoken to Bernardo and interviewed him as well, who's behind a kind of resurgence of idealism, the idea that the mental and consciousness is the primary substrate of reality, and that we should understand everything through there. I wonder if you could sort of, for those that aren't so familiar watching this, can you maybe sort of tell us a little bit about idealism and the non-dual path, and for you how it connects to spiritual intelligence, because I think it's a big part of your step 2 or 3. I can't remember which one now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So idealism is the philosophical view that the basic stuff of the world is more mind-like or mental than it is more matter-like or material. So you might say that inner life subjectivity, as we tend to think of it, is the more fundamental aspect of ourselves, and then the material world is an expression or manifestation of that. And intuitively, that seems right, even though the dominant philosophy of the materialistic age is the other way around. It says that matter's the fundamental stuff, and that somehow mental life springs from the neurons in our brain. So, but we actually experience life most directly as mind-like or material or mental, not material, because we have experiences, and then from that we make inferences about the material world around us. And again, modern physics, I think, is more aligned with the idealistic view, at least the panpsychist view, which is a sort of variant on idealism. And I think that's a big part of why panpsychism, idealism is at least getting another look by philosophers. Now I'm just trying to remember the second part. Oh yes, so and Rupert Spira and Bernardo Kastrup. So Bernardo is really good at making the philosophical case for this. He's hugely well qualified in terms of the science as well. What Rupert suggests and then offers as a practice or even set of thought experiments is a way to relatively quickly access this fundamental perception that all things are one. He often does it through considering what you mean when you say I am, and who is the I that's saying I am sitting, I am talking, I am aware of it being Sunday afternoon. And we're inclined to focus on what comes after the I am, he would say. But if you take this intuitive step back and consider the I, then you begin to get in touch with that part of you which is timeless, unchanging, always present in the details that are then added to it. And this is part of a long tradition. I mean, I think it's in the West as well, but perhaps it most obviously for us now comes out of Indian traditions, and particularly this way of putting it from the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi, but part of a wider Advaita Vedanta school, which is also known as non-dualism. Advaita just means non-dual. And this is the direct path, because the idea is you try and get some fairly speedy intuition about the I-ness that runs through all things. Because once you've established your own I am, it's then just another step to realize that everyone else around you shares the same qualities of I-ness, which is why we can speak at all. If my I amness was completely isolated from your I amness, then it would be a struggle, if not impossible, to communicate. But it's because we somehow share a common sense of being, which is then expressed in words, that meaning and so on can be shared by us. So that pooled awareness of being is the first step for the direct path. And then once some sort of intimation of that is gained and becomes either accessible, again, we can return to it, if not established fully throughout the course of the day. The next steps, or as Rupert has put it, if that's chapter 1, chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on, going on, is how life therefore comes to be known differently on the basis of this fundamental perception. And that's a great task in the modern world, because we tend to be born in a world that doesn't think like that treats us as separate, isolated individuals that struggle to make connection and struggle to relate to the world more broadly. And sometimes this is called the Tantric move. If the Vedantic move is to establish the sense of the fundamental truth of ourselves, then the Tantric move is then to fill out life with that fundamental sense. And insofar as my book makes a contribution to that, it's much more in the Tantric mode. So I ask about what it means to experience time differently as a result of this, or what it means to experience our inner life or soul in relation to this, what death might look like differently because of this. And that's broadly why there's the 7 steps, to cover off a sort of a good spread of different parts of ourselves and how they're fundamental and can be perceived in fundamentally different ways through this Advaita tradition.
And I was just thinking as well, like the link between Bernardo and Rupert. I mean, in a sense, it's what Rupert's offering and what you're stressing there in step 2 or 3 is a science in a way, isn't it? Because when you think of like, what do we back to Descartes in a sense, but what do I know for sure? If we're interested in what you said, it's quite rightly, it's an inference to get to matter. We don't know it directly, I guess. What we know directly is our experience of matter, whatever matter actually is. So for me, it sort of raises that question. What is scientia? What is knowing? And that links then, I suppose, to your the spiritual intelligence. What do we mean by I guess in the sense of inviting an expanded idea of scientia, of science.
Yeah, Scientia is used in the ancient world, in the medieval world, but rather than meaning following the scientific method as it's now being described, doing experiments, having them verified by other people doing the same, and then developing technology off the back of that. Scientia used just to mean a kind of any coherent body of knowledge. So it had a sort of internal consistency. And so theology was regarded as a science because it aims to be coherent and consistent. So Descartes, I sometimes feel a bit sorry for Descartes because what he's most famous for is his meditations, which he drew. Actually, he was trained by the Jesuits and drew from a spiritual tradition, which is to try and establish the kind of core. And he famously summarized it as, "I think, therefore I am." So he's putting the mental at the fundamental of all things there. But he also, made remarks about res extensa, the extended thing, the material world, being different from res cognitans, the mental thing. And so inner and outer tends to get split, certainly in the popular appropriation of Descartes. I mean, he himself actually thought that our material life and our mental life are both reflections of a divine quality that holds and contains them both. It's just that we're inclined to experience them in 2 ways. So he would be what you might call, I don't know, a qualified non-dualism, or a 2-aspect unity of things. But yeah, the risk is, particularly in a world where res extensa, the material stuff, becomes very powerful, very desirable, tends to dominate life. We forget the res cognitans, and so are inclined to discount our mental life, which of course is why psychotherapy comes along, because we can't discount our mental life. We get into terrible trouble when we do, and so therefore you need a healing tradition like psychotherapy to help with that.
And what you were just saying there kind of makes me think of there's a phrase or something, I can't remember the word for word what you said, but you quoted, I think you quoted someone in the book. You were talking about I think it might have been William Blake, the tyranny of the demonstrable or something. It was like, the place that almost the sort of idealization of empiricism, I guess, as how I read you.
Yeah, and Blake was onto this, still relatively early on in the the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, and realized that the clarion call, as he puts it in one of his poems, by demonstration alone man may live, not by faith, was going to come to dominate. And he spotted that, well, the thing is that demonstration alone is itself a kind of faith. It is a way of seeing the world.
It's almost like the Reformation. It reminds me of that sort of, that sort of by grace alone, whatever, that, faith alone. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's pretending it's not. And that's where it's perverse, because it's claiming. I mean, if you think about it, one of the things that always strikes me about science is that science claims to have this kind of timelessness. A lot of the things which originally was associated with God, it's subjective, it's true, and so on. And yet, I'm old enough and did my physics degree long enough ago now to realize that physics changes remarkably quickly, certainly in cycles of decades. And a lot of what is now taken to be the best theory by physicists wasn't even heard of actually back in the 1980s when I was doing physics. It's always worth remembering it's a subjective that actually is much more substantial. You can read, I don't know, the writers of Inner Vita Vedanta who wrote 2 millennia or more ago, and they'll still speak to you. Buddhist psychology still speaks to people. Indeed, what the Christian equivalent, the writers on inner life in the Christian tradition, the church, the desert fathers and mothers, people like Evagrius Ponticus and so on, it reads very much like modern psychology. Whereas you wouldn't think of, well, even reading Newton. I did a physics degree. I don't think we read a word of Newton. So it's the sciences that actually, the modern sciences, that are the ones that change.
Yeah, interesting. And I wonder if we sort of come on to psychotherapy, because you brought that up there. It's something I've thought for a while. Because I mean, I'm trained psychodynamically originally, and I still love psychodynamic therapy and models of thought. And then I trained in CBT, so I work in the NHS in my day job. And I've done some positive psychology and stuff as well. But what is it actually, particularly when I was doing positive psychology, I was doing that alongside my psychodynamic training. And my sense was, I was reading these papers, all these mechanisms and, causal explanations, and it's very sort of generic and non-personal, and then the psychodynamic was very sort of phenomenological and what was going on in the space between people and all this kind of thing. But I know this sort of echoed with me in your book, really. This sense in which psychology, if it's not careful, can become quite kind of reductive, and it's obsession sometimes in some course, especially in the self-help industry, maybe as well. With techniques and methods and mechanisms and so on. This sort of reductive view of humanity as well. Just tinker around with the clockwork a bit, and you'll kind of you think things will work out better for you. I know I'm also interested in sort of acceptance commitment therapy as well, which I know, like people like Steve Hayes, it's moving away from that and saying you can't just have diagnostic categories that sort of understand everybody and so on, and we need to get back into the much more kind of, what's the word, non-methetic, I can't remember, but the more thinking of the actual individual's person's root. 1,000 people depression, no two of them will be exactly the same journey to that point. Anyway, I'm waffling, but to get to the point was, where do you think psychology perhaps goes wrong, and how can we recover spiritual intelligence in the way we do and approach psychology and psychotherapy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, but a really important one, because I mean, even in the way you pose the question illustrates the problem that both in psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy even, but also in positive psychology and other more behavioral approaches, there is this kind of dizzying array of techniques, results, methods, suggestions. And again, you don't have to be in this world for very long to realize that 1 year's sort of panacea that's going to cure all mental ills is by the next year already been moved on. And we need to develop it. We don't just need mindfulness. We need compassion or based mindfulness. I think what this is about is psychology, which is a relatively new discipline, described by William James, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. It's always tried to be, not so much in William James actually, but subsequently, metaphysically agnostic. It's tried to stay purely at the level of the phenomena, as if you can just sort of move things around and eventually it'll sort of find a settled place. And I think that the trouble with that is you're only working at one level of the human, of the psyche, which is the most expressed, the most immediate. And that unless you ask not just the deeper questions, which of course psychodynamic psychotherapy does, but the metaphysical questions as well, you're going to be subject to things constantly sort of shifting and moving around. And I think that psychology is very prone to this. There's this widespread problem recognized in psychology of the replication crisis, which is that experiments which in one decade seem to establish something as fundamental, when they're replicated maybe a decade or two later, things have moved on and the old experiments can't be done anymore. And this is very widely recognized, and it's because in the psychological world you're in a reflexive world, where what you take to it very much affects what you see of it, and what you see of it is already responding to what you take to it. And so I think that the psychodynamic intuition that we must constantly be trying to respond to what's in front of us, say in terms of what someone who comes to us brings. There's a lot of truth in that. And I guess someone who's got both the psychodynamic and the positive psychology element is well equipped there, because they'll have the techniques of the positive psychology, but no, they're not just to be followed by the book. They are to be adapted. But nonetheless, I think we do need this deeper question as well, which is the metaphysical, asking, who we are, not just in our the tumor of our psyches, but more widely in our being, and not just in terms of ourselves, but in relation to the universe as a whole, and indeed that within which the universe is held, the divine. I mean, because we human beings have this capacity to relate and reach across all these domains, and unless we're paying attention to all these domains, we will remain uncoupled. So I think the metaphysical is needed in psychology. I don't really know whether there's that much interest in it. People are certainly interested in ecstatic experience, which is beyond just the everyday psyche or everyday neuroses. But I think that, say, in the world of psychedelics, for that engagement with the ecstatic to be grounded again and not just to become another kind of fad, the deeper questions about the world within which these experiences can happen need to be asked. Otherwise, we just go chasing peak experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I've got my moniker for the channel, Transcendent Psychotherapist, is I am really curious as to what, and I don't know if I've got the answers, and it'd be fascinating if there are answers, but fascinating talking to you really as well, because you've given us a great deal of thought as a therapist as well in this interface. What would it look like to do a therapy that was more spiritually intelligent? And I mean, maybe we can link that to, there's a point in the book where you talk about, I think it's the settling the soul step, and you talk about the how the soul almost sort of sits between the ultimate source, or God, if people are happy with the term, and the world. The sense I got, but the advice as well, which is resonant to what you just said a minute ago, of not confusing the soul with the source. Did you want to talk to that, Mark, a bit?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary. And the idea of settling the soul is not that the soul can find its fulfillment within itself, but that it can be settled enough in order to see that within which it exists and where fulfillment is found. This, I think, this is the dominant view in spiritual traditions of one sort or another. So take, for example, Dante and the Divine Comedy. You might say that going through hell and then up Mount Purgatory, the first two parts of the Divine Comedy, are about settling the soul. First of all, seeing what a state it can get into, but then gradually lifting the veils that stop wider life being seen and perceived. And a lot of therapy is to do with that second step of, as it were, peering through that which we've taken to be reality and seeing that there's more. But then in the paradise, Dante becomes more and more aligned with the wider nature of being, which ultimately leads to his unity with the divine. And I think that in therapy, what that means is the therapist listening out for these different kinds of moments. You know, sometimes there's going to be the moment which is very hellish, and to put it very quickly and very easily, of course, it's much more difficult than this, but you try and stay with someone in the darkness. But then at some point, the darkness is likely to lighten, if only because they recognize your ability to tolerate it and your ability as the therapist to tolerate it. And then that can lead to the more purgatorial moment, which is not that suffering ceases, but that suffering starts to be held within a container or an envelope of hope, that more than suffering can be known. And then joy and others, love, these other qualities of life that get lost, start to return with the suffering, kind of coexisting with the suffering, but transforming the experience of suffering as a result. But I think that you can also listen out for moments where that which maybe it has a more timeless quality. Maybe there's a sense that somehow the person's open to that which is coming from without their psyche, though is also strangely at the same time at the heart of them. But there has maybe these qualities of stillness, of something which is felt more like eternity. You know, maybe someone will bring in a line of poetry that they said drew them, and they wondered what that's saying, or maybe they'll have an experience where they seem to step out of themselves, but also felt that they were never more truly themselves in that moment. It can be little things or bigger things, but the therapist's task, I think, in the paradisal moment is to not let it just pass by, because it's very easy for these experiences just to sort of come and go, but to go, no, you know, that dream, that really means something. And let's keep returning to that. It may not be immediately obvious what that means, but, you know, let's see whether it gradually amplifies and yields something that's crucially important.
Yeah, and it sort of reminds me a little bit of David Bentley Hart, the theologian, you know, talking about, uses the phrase the horizon of the good. This, I'm just thinking also resonating with sort of Jung, but also positive psychology has some interest in this as well. This, you know, the flourishing and heading towards, you know, you talked about almost like the spiritual intelligence has a certain sort of receptivity, but I wouldn't call it necessarily passivity, but there's a sort of receptivity. You just talked there about, you know, being alert to something coming in, and maybe is the work for people in a positive psychotherapy, if you like, or a flourishing psychotherapy of flourishing, to be attendant to that ever distant infinite horizon of the good that they're so maybe address that a little bit, Mark.
No, yeah, I mean, Jung makes this remark that every experience makes an ethical demand on you. It asks you how you're going to respond to this thing that's being received. And that's because, you know, again, as we were saying earlier, we live in this reflexive world. And as the Neoplatonists would put it, we can only know that which we're most resonant with. So if your soul the more active, immediate part of yourself is very resonant with the darkness, you'll experience the cosmos as darkness because you'll pick up what is dark in the cosmos. Whereas if your soul increasingly becomes more resonant with the light, then you'll know that the cosmos is full of light as well, and ultimately originates from light. And so the virtues, would be another way of putting it, really matter. And I think positive psychology has made this move, actually, hasn't it? More from techniques about how to sustain your happiness to the kind of qualities of your character that are going to build for a better life. So flourishing is a more virtue kind of word. And the metaphysical piece would take that just a step further and say the reason why virtues deliver this is because reality itself is shaped in a virtue kind of way. And we know this because the so-called transcendentals, the good, the beautiful, and the true in particular, they don't only just draw us, but they reveal themselves to us as the basis of reality. This is, sort of perhaps most easy to be persuaded by in relation to that which is beautiful, because as Platonists and others noted, tangible, empirical things in the world can be beautiful. And we might argue about other things that are or aren't beautiful, but a sunset would be viewed by most people as beautiful. And then that can begin an exploration of how it's not just our minds projecting beauty onto things, but that our minds are drawn towards that which is beautiful. And as someone like Plotinus would say, the eye that can see the sun must be sun-like in certain ways. And what he's saying there is that you could only experience the beauty of the sun if there was beauty within you that could resonate with the beauty of the sun, which is why these are sort of big experiences. The quality of the experience is not just me registering something as if it were a fact, it's being drawn into it.
Yeah, that's funny how you're thinking the same things at the same time, which I know in therapy is a good sign, isn't it? You're kind of on the same wavelength. But yeah, it's like,
well, it's because we're sharing the one being. Discussion can draw that down as well, and so it's saying the same thing, but in a different way.
We're seeing it happening in our conversation, and and I was wondering in that I was literally thinking at the same time as you were that almost back to that I am, so that the I am that is the source of all, maybe this a plenipotential fullness of all, pleroma or whatever word we want to use, of all being, is where we deeply come from. The I am of ourselves is that same essential source in a way, is the Vedantan insight, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's at the heart of Christian mysticism as well. I increasingly feel increasingly happy to call myself a Christian. I'm, as you mentioned at the beginning, I used to be a priest, and I left very disillusioned with the church, and very wary of Christianity. And of course, Christianity is many, many things, and there's a lot of kinds of Christianity that I would find, abhorrent, let alone inconducive myself. But the broad strand of Christian mysticism, which someone like David Bentley Hart writes about, is, for me, being a Western person, is actually increasingly a kind of natural way to try to talk about these things. It's not always a public mode of discourse, and so even today we've talked about Advaita Vedanta first because it feels, I think, a little bit safe to talk about it in that way, because Christianity is so shapes and distorts what we might otherwise try and say. But I think it is, and this word I am, and Rupert Spira would say this as well, actually. He's increasingly saying, I think, that he first gained these perceptions actually from his Christian upbringing, but then as it were had to make a pathway to other traditions in order for that to become more clear to him. Perhaps, I don't know if he would put it quite like that, but something like that, perhaps. And I think that, trying to talk about it in Christian ways, and the word I am particularly is pivotal there, because the revelation of God as I am is a seminal moment in the Hebrew scriptures, from which, of course, Christianity draws as well. And then Jesus as this archetypal human, or a path for all our humanities. He too talked about I am. And of course, in the modern world, we very much value being able to say I am, because being an individual and understanding yourself as an individual brings such very great goods. But the trouble is that being an individual has morphed into individualism, and the sense of divide from others. So recovering this spiritual tradition in Christianity that has a much richer way of understanding the nature of being I am, I think could be very useful.
Yeah, so not an atomistic split off I am, so much as that what you talked about, which is the spiritual commons, wasn't it, in the book?
Yeah. No. So that my I amness is a portal into that which is shared.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe taking a tantric turn, because you're very, and you said earlier, didn't you, that there's a quite concern to be spiritually intelligent about the real world in which we live, really. And I think you addressed that nicely in the book. So I can't remember which step it was now, Mark, but one of the steps you talk about, is it the one where you talk about death? Yeah, I think it's this. There's this kind of balance between not being so attached to the world and things and relationships and activities and so on. I know Spira talks about this as well, that we are just lose our freedom. Maybe I'm reading it onto your work here, my own kind of how I read it, but the balance between non-attachment, I suppose, and at the same time avoiding spiritual bypassing or avoidance, where we become so spiritual we're just detached from the world, which I think is a theme you see in all sorts of traditions. I've seen that particularly in the non-dual tradition, people struggling, to they're losing touch with the world as if it's kind of meaningless. But you are quite keen that we don't do that, and that we get that balance right between non-attachment and engagement, I suppose, with the world. How do we do that in a spiritually intelligent way?
Well, the word engagement I find quite a useful one, because you can be engaged with the world completely and still be free within the world, because of the quality of your engagement, rather than a kind of engagement that wants to change the world, fix the world, control the world, possess the world. That's an unfree kind of engagement, because the world will always defeat you in the end. And this is debated in Advaita Vedanta, often around the word Maya, delusion or ignorance. And the debate is everything that we perceive Maya, an illusion, or is the way that we perceive it often a delusion? And so in the second way, that Maya is about the way we perceive rather than just the sheer perception. Someone like Rupert Spira will be of this second school. And so the question is not to become detached from the world, but to be engaged with it in a way that sees through the misperceptions, the ignorance, and sees essentially through to the unity, to the oneness. And so relates deeply to the world, because how could it be any other if you're one with everything, but from the basis of that unity. And that's what makes a freedom as well, because any particular is always just a reflection of the universal, and so can be let go of as much as it can be engaged. William Blake has a very nice quatrain that it's 4 lines that I've sort of lived with for a long time, and I've no doubt will continue to keep trying to understand that bit more, what he's captured. But he talks about he who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So if you try and bind happiness, joy to yourself, then you destroy winged life, because it's always on the move. Whereas if you learn how to kiss the joy as it flies, then you learn to fly with it and live in eternity's sunrise. But that's why this theme of life and death are so deeply intertwined, because every moment of life is also a moment of letting go in order to stay in that winged state. But it's also letting go of, you might say, the small self into the larger self. Although, just to add another twist to it, Dante, who's very seminal for me, he also realized that actually the letting go is to actually become more and more yourself. So it's not a denial of the self, the individual. It's not, as it were, an erasure of the ego, but is the way in which that which we thought of as our sort of small isolated ego actually becomes more and more fully itself. When he's in paradise, he recognizes the souls he meets not as becoming a sort of undifferentiated unity with the divine, but as myriad full reflections of the divine. And I think this is actually a common intuition. If you see great spiritual teachers, you also meet often a very well-defined character or personality. The Dalai Lama has a very particular presence as a human being, as well as bringing the sense that there's a whole lot more going on in the room with the Dalai Lama than just this one human being. And I think that's because the particular and the universal actually coincide when the particular is most fully itself and not a narrow, a more restricted version.
And that was interesting what you said there, because the theme of the one and the many was going on for me again there. Where people often in our consumerist society, maybe in particular, we might take a political turn in a second, or meta-crisis turn in a minute. I know you talk about in the book, but perhaps people get so absorbed in this and that and that and this and the manyness of life, but lose the unity of life, which spiritual intelligence would provide. But then other people might get to lose touch with the ground, become ungrounded, and get only focused in on the sort of the one and the abstract and so on, But I'm wondering where the Trinitarian aspect, again, come back to that, comes in here, that inclusion of the one, the many in the one that you talked about earlier. Is that a way in which we can be, because you've got that whole kind of incarnational idea, haven't you, within Christianity, that very, it's, you're in touch with the one, but it's very much interested in the world at the same time.
Yeah, just in parenthesis, Rob, I should say that I'm going to have to go actually fairly soon now. So I should have said at the top that I only had an hour or so.
Okay, sure. We'll wrap up soon.
Yeah, but I'll let me pick up your question. I think that the Trinitarian way of understanding does have a way of perceiving this, because one way of putting the Trinitarian idea that threeness is the best way of talking about oneness is to think about something like, what it is to know or what it is to love. And, when I love my beloved, it's not just me and the beloved, but there's the loving itself. There's a third thing. And when I know that which is known, there's the knowing itself, which again is this kind of third quality. And so a particular thing, loving someone or knowing something, brings with it the universal quality of loving or knowing. And that is the Trinitarian expansion of the particular. Again, to quote William Blake, it's why he can say to see heaven in a wild flower or a world in a grain of sand. He's looking at something very particular, grain of sand or a wild flower, but in that experience knows heaven or knows a world.
That was very it took me a moment to get what you were saying there, and it suddenly clicked. So that's a really helpful way of looking at it, that phenomenologically or experientially we kind of know this.
It's not about floating off into abstract life or getting completely lost in isolated particularities, but by being aware of the experience, again, having this kind of ground of awareness, the spiritual intelligence can open up to us the rich quality of what's going on, all day, every day.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, Mark, I will let you go because you've got other things to do now. But it's been a very enjoyable conversation, I have to say. I very much enjoyed the book, and also I recommend it to anybody. Title again, Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps by Mark Vernon, available on Amazon, but also other good publishers as well. So, and maybe we could do this again sometime, Mark. It's been a really interesting confluence of ideas and interests, I think.
Yeah, look, thank you. And you mentioned meta crisis and so on. So there's a lot more things we could discuss. I'd be delighted to do that sometime.
Brilliant. Okay, well, have a good rest of your day, and thanks again for letting me interview you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good to talk.
Likewise. Take care, Mark.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.